Today's session is Instructional Design for a Global Audience. And nowadays, advances in technology mean it's easier than ever to reach a global audience, to get content to far more people than was possible in the past. The widening availability of high-speed internet, mass ownership of connected devices, for example. These things now mean it's possible to reach audiences around the globe on an unprecedented scale. In addition, the sheer number of tools and technologies available to instructional designers to create learning content is vast. Learning is available in so many different shapes and forms. Gone are the days when the only option was in-person training using slide projections and paper handouts. These two things mean there are more opportunities than ever to reach a global audience. But the proliferation of tools and technology and the vast audience that can potentially be reached can bring challenges too. What I hope today's session will achieve is to provide you with insight and guidance to navigate this landscape. Insight that I hope will assist you in making instructional design decisions to successfully reach a global audience. What do we mean by success? In order for learning content to succeed, two things are required. Outputs, the assets themselves. The content needs to be available to learners. And outcomes. Those assets, that content, needs to deliver the required learning outcome. Success requires both of these things. There is, however, normally a significant constraint: cost, budget. How then can these three factors be balanced? The Holy Trinity, if you like, is reaching as wide an audience as possible, whilst maximising impact, resonating with the entire audience wherever they may be, at the lowest possible localization cost. Let's consider this as a global content spectrum. On one axis is reach, how many people can receive the output, and on the other is resonance, how effective it is at delivering the required outcomes. The money marks the spot. And at one theoretical extreme, shown here, we have instructional content that requires no changes for a global audience. There's no localization effort or cost, and the number of people we can reach is potentially infinite. For example, an animated video with no language-specific or culturally specific content, no text, no speech, and therefore no translation, no effort required at all in order to localize. The cost would be low, but will it resonate with that audience? And perhaps, in some cases, it would, but that's likely to be a very limited set of circumstances, certainly not for many types of content and for most learning outcomes. So at this one extreme, we're very constrained in what our content can be, what it can achieve. Although we've reached a lot of people, potentially, the content is unlikely to work for them all. At the other extreme of this spectrum is content that is extremely complex, uses every available feature, all the bells and whistles, text heavy, full of video and audio, quizzes galore, you name it, it's got it. Fantastic content may result that really works, has a high resonance level. But because it's content rich and complexly designed, localization cost is likely to be sky high, perhaps prohibitively high. It can't be localized at scale, and so can only reach a small audience as a result. So there's this huge available spectrum. There's no right and no wrong place to be, no particular place that's the correct place. That will all depend on your needs, your subject matter, your intended audience, the type of content, the learning outcomes you require. Ordinarily, it's likely to fall somewhere in the middle. Cost will be a barrier, but there's still a vital need to widen the audience, the reach, as far as possible, whilst ensuring the content resonates with as many people as possible within that audience. And this is the challenge. Technology now means there are myriad options: multimedia, video, audio, augmented reality, virtual reality, and on, and continually changing. These technologies have the potential to be extremely time-consuming and costly to create and to localize. Feature-rich can often mean expensive. So if budgets are fixed, as they almost invariably are, how then do you get the best return, the most value for your spend? Let's assume that your content will require some level of localization. How can learner-centric, engaging content be delivered in as many languages as possible? How do you ensure you reach the sweet spot on this spectrum for your needs and balance reach, resonance with cost and scalability? So that if you have a localization budget of $10,000 and presently your content goes into 5 languages because localization costs $2,000 per language, could you make changes that meant without sacrificing learning outcomes, learner experience, you reduce localization cost so that each language costs $1,000, meaning your content goes into 10 languages rather than 5? The reach has increased significantly without impacting resonance. And to do this, localization can take up a significant chunk of budget. The costs of translation, engineering, audio recording, video work, and so on. So it may seem the obvious place to look to reduce these costs incurred during the translation phase, negotiating lower prices from LSPs or translators, for example, or by working with a cheaper recording studio. My argument today is that the focus shouldn't be on the translation phase. Translation happens at the end of the process. On a fundamental level, translated content, whatever its nature, is a mirror of the English source. It's the same content in a different language. It is the English source that determines the cost required for localization. The real opportunities for significant savings come earlier on, not at the translation stage. They come from making different decisions during the design and authoring stage, because that's where the English source content is shaped. And as we move down this content creation road, the ability to influence how scalable the content is, the localization process is, that ability diminishes. The key premise of today's session is that it's the choices made at the instructional design phase that allow the translation process to be as streamlined and as efficient as possible. And again, we're looking not to have a negative impact on the end result. We're looking to reduce or remove wasted effort that means costs can be reduced and scalability is improved. So you're getting the most for your money rather than sacrificing the learner experience. I've talked about making decisions early on, but what types of decisions? How can this be done? I've spoken now about the premise, so let's get down to the detail. When I began putting this session together, I tried to categorize these decisions made at the instructional design phase, into 3 key types: tools, design, and content. I tried and failed because these 3 seem so intricately linked. There's so much overlap between them. What I'll instead then try to do is I very roughly put these into chronological order, the types of decisions that might be made throughout the process. So let's start at the very beginning, at the inception of an idea. My first and perhaps most important point is to think localization. We looked at the content journey, and translation happens at the end of the process. That doesn't mean, though, that translation and localization as a whole should only be considered at the end. This is probably the single most important point because it's the biggest pitfall that I've encountered. A mindset that localization isn't about me, doesn't relate to me, that's something that somebody else does. Translators do that, or the localization team, RLSP, localization's for them. My advice is instead to think of the impact that your decisions have on localization. And you don't have to have the answers. Partner with your LSP, ask your localization team. If I do this, what will it mean? Will this work? Is there a different way? Can we achieve the same thing in a way that reduces localization effort? The key then is think localization. My second point is related, and it's to consider your global audience. Knowing who your audience is needs to inform decisions during the design and authoring process, because we need to be able to reach that audience, or as many of that audience as possible. A word of caution, because it is likely that when you create content, you're aware who the intended audience is, be it internal employees within a company, particular countries or regions around the world. But I've experienced on a number of occasions instances where content has been created seemingly safe in the knowledge that there's a limited audience, and as a result the content has been designed with that in mind, without considering the possible need to scale up to reach other markets in future. And if that need then does arise later on down the line, that content isn't suitable. Perhaps because of the content itself, or because of the lack of scalability. What I would suggest then is that it's possibly always worth designing with a potential global audience in mind, because you never know what may happen in the future, what additional audiences your content may need to resonate with. In terms of considering a global audience then, firstly, consider potential physical barriers to learning. Some examples are connectivity. Is your audience online, in the place you expect them to consume the content? Not everyone has an internet connection at home, for example. Will firewalls prevent access to a particular platform or content type? And consider bandwidth. If somebody isn't able to download content or stream content successfully because their internet connection isn't fast enough, that's a significant barrier. Don't assume everyone has high-speed internet if all of your audience don't. And platform or device. What platform or device will your audience be using? Is it a cell phone, a tablet, a laptop or a PC? And will they be using iPhones or Android phones, Firefox or Chrome? What you don't want is to exclude portions of your intended audience because of decisions that are made that don't consider these potential barriers. Understand these constraints for your entire audience, and don't assume these things are the same in all countries or for all demographics, for example. Make tooling and design decisions then that allow for these constraints. You don't want content to exist that people can't access because of physical barriers. Another point with regards to platforms and devices is that by narrowing these down, it can mean reducing the scope and effort in localization testing, because you can then specify to your localization vendor exactly what parameters should be used for testing, and there's no wastage there. Second, consider cultural barriers to learning and engagement. What works for different people in different countries? What do people want? Again, it's dangerous to assume everyone has the same wants or needs or the same points of cultural reference. If you can, Ask questions of your learners. Or if you can't ask the learners themselves, ask trusted colleagues who may know more about those learners than you do. This is important on two fronts, I think. The first is to ensure that the content works for everyone. But equally importantly, it does impact engagement because people love to be listened to and in being involved in the process. Just the action of asking can engender buy-in and up engagement if people are listened to and if their opinions are heard. On the other hand, if people don't feel that content has been designed for them, that can impact engagement straight away. If you're thinking, this was designed for somebody else, I'm just an afterthought, there's an obvious cultural barrier, for example, then again, that doesn't foster high levels of engagement. So ask, how can you deliver content that resonates with them culturally? Are there cultural references, images or iconography that won't travel well, photographs of specific places or people that can be removed to make the content more global? Also, ask if they want or need the content at all, and if so, does it need to be localized for them? I could offer half a dozen examples of this that I've come across, but I'll quickly touch on two. The first was a body of product-related training material instigated by a company's global headquarters, localized into over 25 languages. But in the end, half or more of those target markets didn't in fact sell that product and couldn't sell that product for regulatory reasons. That localization budget was essentially flushed down the drain because they hadn't asked if that was appropriate content for those markets. Another example is a training project that was targeted at a very specific group of internal employees at a specific level, people in a specific role at a global company, and this was localized for its 5 largest regional offices. It was a really substantial program of work, and it had a really significant localization cost attached to it. Each language cost over $100,000. Again, however, the in-country employees in those offices weren't consulted. The content was localized and delivered to them to use, and in one of those 5 markets, the response was, well, thanks for that, but all of those people speak English. Everybody at that level must speak English. So there's no need for us to have had this localized. Over $100,000 was wasted because the audience hadn't been asked what they needed. My first and second points are about thinking about localization, building it into the decision-making process, and that's really key for my next point too. Every piece of content that requires localization involves effort, cost, and time. But how much? And is that amount worth the cost, given the value it delivers to the learner, the experience it delivers, what it adds? And consider it not just for the English source, because this is really important. It needs to be scalable. These costs add up when you're going into multiple languages. So consider and balance cost against benefit, and consider value at scale. Ask this question, and in many cases the benefit does outweigh the cost. There's worth in that content. But if the answer is no, then perhaps that feature could be removed. Or is there a more efficient way, a more streamlined way of delivering the same result at a lower cost by removing wasted effort? And this might be a change in tool or a change in design, a change in the way the content is created. I'll share some examples of this type of decision. First, let's look at some ways to remove effort through tooling. This comes back to the question of, can we deliver the same or perhaps even a better result by using a different tool? A fairly fundamental one to start with, because some tools are well designed to work with localization and others really aren't. In some tools, there are tasks that are automated that in other tools are manual. An example is being able to export and re-import translated content at the click of a button versus having to manually copy and paste strings of content out and back into a tool. Let's consider then the example of a text-heavy interactive quiz. If the tool used doesn't support this automation, and the import and export task has to be done manually, copying and pasting content, that could easily take an hour and a half for each language. Let's say there are 20 languages, and there's 15 of these videos a year. If the quiz had been designed in another tool, though, that allowed the automation of this task, that effort and that cost could be removed entirely. And the end results, the end learner experience, wouldn't be any different. It perhaps might be improved because there wouldn't be the potential for error in this copy and paste process. So considering this one area alone, again, the question is that difference worth the effort and the cost? Is there a better way? Coming back again to this question of analysing and weighing every area that requires localization effort, another key one is the need to tweak content after translation. This is normally to do with layout and design, having to change to make things fit, for example. I can share an example of a client of ours who changed their instructional design tool from one that created content within fixed screen dimensions, fixed parameters, to a tool that created dynamic scrolling content that resized automatically to fit the user's screen size. This meant that there was no need for this manual tweaking. Everything was done dynamically, all of these layout changes. Font size was changed, text boxes were resized, and so on. When using the old tool, the content would be translated, and then a significant number of manual tweaks would need to be made. As a rough guide, using the old tool, the effort required to make these kind of changes shown on screen was about 3 hours per language for each lesson. There were 12 lessons in a unit ordinarily, and 5 languages. Over the course of a year, we would work on an average of 3 units. Again, by changing the tool that was used, that effort and that cost was removed. And just to make clear, this is an annual cost that we're showing here, meaning it's an ongoing cost. The tooling change meant that this cost was removed for all projects in the future. As the years went by, the amount of saving increased. And I hope this magnitude of cost saving illustrates my premise that it's these types of decisions about tools, design and content during the instructional design phase, that have the potential to result in savings on a scale that isn't possible during the translation phase, particularly when we consider that these changes can often result in a very similar or perhaps an improved end output for the learner. We're not reducing quality, we're just looking for savings by reducing wasted effort. Which brings me to my next decision type, designing out wasted effort. Let's consider an online learning course which contains narrator voiceover. The on-screen text steps through various actions and is timed to the narrator's voiceover with cues, much like this session today. For the English version, the engineer is likely to speak English, so can simply listen to the audio, identify those cues in his head as he goes, and adjust the timings accordingly. When we localize, though, the engineer won't speak every, or possibly any, of the localized languages, so they need to be told when those cues are. when the narrator speaks a particular word, for example, this is an additional step and needs to be done by a native speaker. They need to listen to the audio and put the cues in. The engineer then needs to retime the on-screen action to fit, and as a result, these costs can be significant. However, this can be done another way, and it's a different way of looking at how audio works. Instead of trigger cues being timed, being linked to when a word is said, can they be timed to something else, something obvious, something that won't change and isn't language specific? The end or start of an audio file, for example. I show this here in a very simplified illustration. In the top example, cue markers are required because the audio is one long file. The word, the cue, has to be identified so that the retiming can be done. In the bottom example, that step isn't required because the cue is the start of the audio file. And of course, this only works if the cue is at the start and end of a sentence. But again, when this is scaled up, when the additional effort and cost is scaled up, it begs the question, is it worth having cues in the middle of sentences, or can we make do with ones at the start of sentences because of the saving that can potentially be made? And I think that this example helps to illustrate that localization effort in terms of instructional design content really isn't just about translation. There are many more areas where costs accrue and where savings can be made. When looking for ways to design out effort, look at any step, any content that requires localization effort. And for all of this, ask that question, is it adding sufficient value to justify that effort? Let's look at another example. This is of the need to recreate screen captures. The question is often, is everything that's shown on screen necessary? Is it adding value to the learner? Does an engineer need to spend time exactly recreating the files in a menu, for example, the same options, so that localized and English screens exactly match? Or, if there isn't value in some content, can a simplified user interface be used? We can take a look at an example of this, and it's an example I've just grabbed from our Rubric website. It is localizable content. It might be decided to keep this in English, but again, does that show to our learners that we're not thinking about them? It isn't designed for them. On the other hand, the use of simplified user interface means no localization is required. This is simply an illustrative example of a type of content. And this again begs that question of value, because there obviously is a change to what the learner sees. And it will be up to you to balance cost against benefit for the learner. What I can say is that in projects where we have worked on screen recordings using simplified user interface, meaning that there's content that requires no localization effort, or very minimal localization effort in comparison to the real content, if you like, localization engineering effort and costs have reduced by as much as 90%. 90. That question again, is it worth it? My next example is on the same theme, that question of value. Is content adding value? I'll share a video clip shortly that will start to play on screen. And again, this is actually a clip from a Rubric video. Have a look and see if you can spot the content that requires localization, but might be of questionable value. Here we go.
But as you know, things are never that simple in practice. If you're not already dealing with internal miscommunications, wasted effort, and organizational silos, other globalizational bottlenecks inevitably appear out of nowhere that delay product launches and hurt your ROI. And, if you're not careful, product messaging in foreign countries can end up being inconsistent, misleading, or downright unusable, hurting your brand on the global stage.
What did you think? What, if anything, did you think was of questionable value in this video? To my mind, the messaging in this video is primarily conveyed through the audio by the narrator voiceover. You're listening to what he has to say. But there were 3 words that appeared in English on screen as well. Just 3 words. If this video were to reach a global audience, it goes without saying that the voiceover would need to be localized. But there's the potential that we wouldn't need to retime the video because we could build white space into the audio to allow that to be filled, to mean the timing didn't really matter as much. There were no specific cues on when exactly something had to happen. But those 3 words changed that, because he said them exactly when they appeared. So we would have to translate those 3 words, and that is a seemingly insignificant effort. But the video would then need to be retimed so that the on-screen text appeared when the narrator said those words in each localized version, because it certainly wouldn't be at exactly the same point as in the English. The on-screen text might also need to be adjusted and repositioned, font sizes changed, for example. Those 3 words could easily equate to $150 worth of effort. If we were going into, say, 25 languages, consider the cost versus the benefit. Do you think it's worth it? Again, there's no right or wrong answer. The most important thing is to ask the question. The final area I want to consider is the content itself, the words in particular. And again, it's that same question of value. With regards to the content, there are 2 key points. The first is the total volume of content. Essentially, when it comes to localization, words cost money. So the volume can have a significant impact on cost and scalability. Are there opportunities to reduce the total word count? As a simplistic example, if we were to say in 100 words what we had previously said in 200, that could halve the translation cost because the word count has been halved. The second point is reuse of content. This graphic is an oversimplification. There are nuances to do with translation memories and matching algorithms and pricing, but the idea illustrates the potential scale of savings. Are there opportunities to reuse content, to make content identical or similar rather than slightly different, if the meaning can or should be the same? I'll share an example of how this works in practice. We began work at the end of last year on a body of content for an instructor-led training series. Each lesson had a facilitator guide, participant guide, the presentation itself, and various handouts as well. Originally, this content had been written in English for an English-speaking audience, never intending that it be localized. That then changed, and the need to localize the content arose. However, the English source content in its existing state meant that localization was prohibitively expensive. Each language cost too much, and mainly because of these 2 areas, volume of content and lack of reuse. It was very, very verbose, very wordy, and unnecessarily so in some areas. Also, the interrelationship between these different pieces hadn't really been considered, both within a lesson, the facilitator guide, the participant guide, and between lessons, different facilitator guides, for example. There was the potential to more effectively reuse content and to reduce the total volume of words. We worked with this client to identify areas for improvement, where content could be made more concise and could be more effectively reused. Some examples I can share. In the facilitator guide, for example, the text would say things like, begin the session by asking the learners the following question, or ask the learners the following questions. These are two examples, but in reality there were probably in excess of 20 different variations on this same idea. Ask the learners this thing. Across all of the facilitator guides for all lessons, there were more than 200 instances. In all instances, this was replaced with one word, ask. It's more concise and repeatable, without really losing much meaning. It may even be easier for the facilitator as there isn't so much noise. Over 3,000 source words were removed from the translation scope through this one change alone. 3,000 words that would have required translation into each language. For 10 languages, that's 30,000 words. Again, it's that question of value. Are these slight differences in this slightly wordy way of saying something worth that cost? Similarly, between the content pieces, the facilitator guide, participant guide, and presentation, these contained very similar content, but it wasn't the same, and it could be. This was changed so, where appropriate, the different content types shared identical content instead of slight variations. The result was that the overall volume of content was reduced and reuse was improved. The cost per language therefore reduced, and for the same budget, the client was able to localize into 50% more languages. This meant they could reach the global audience they wanted to reach without impacting the resonance of the content. Another example of where the potential for reuse can be considered is in audio and video. Here we have a number of different costs associated with the content. There's the translation, but there's also audio recording, video engineering, and so on. So again, small changes here can make a significant difference to cost. Are there ways to generalize scripts so they can be reused between lessons, for example, or to reuse some of the same content in video clips? Here are some examples from a series of lessons we worked on. There were around 40 lessons in total, and in each lesson, the narrator would say these lines. The top two are one example, the bottom two another. In every one, reference was made to the specific lesson number, lesson 1, lesson 2, and so on. But does every lesson number need to be spelt out? Again, when we scale this up, the additional translation, the additional audio recording, and engineering effort required soon adds up to a significant amount, and is it worth it? Instead, could the narrator just say, in this lesson? And that can then be reused in every lesson without the need to re-record and retranslate 40 different variations of this sentence. That concludes the examples that I have, and to summarize, I want to come back to my very first message. In order to successfully reach a global audience, think localization. Because when localization is considered, there can be golden opportunities to reach new audiences, resonate with those audiences, whilst getting the most for your money, the most bang for your buck.